Hello, our set of notes today is entitled Coral Reefs. What we're going to be looking at here is just a little bit about the basic structure of coral reefs. We'll actually get into some more detail a little bit later on in the school year about coral reefs and in our interactions with them. But since we're talking about the cnidarians right now, coral reefs are a pretty big part of the organisms that make up that group, the cnidaria, are these corals. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. If we take a look here at the reef construction first, what actually makes up these particular reefs, remember that, like I said, corals are the cnidarians. They're in that class Anthozoa. Now, these particular organisms, the anthozoans, are polyps. That is, they're the vase-shaped. They're attached onto a substrate. Well, these particular polyps are a little bit different. They produce a calcium carbonate, Ca, calcium, CO3, that's the carbonate, so CaCO3 skeleton. And that gives these particular organisms a good body support structure, a little bit different than those jellies or the other anemones or the hydra. Those particular organisms have a hydrostatic skeleton. These guys, they have a very, very hard skeleton made up of that calcium carbonate. The kind of, so that's our body support, the kind of organisms that are actually doing this are called the scleractinian corals, a particular type of coral. Now, we talked about the corals being anthozoans. Well, that's our class, and we can continue going from the domain, the kingdom, the phylum class to the orders. The scleractinian corals are a particular type or order of those corals. And here's one right over here. This is a brain coral. Kind of looks a little bit like a human brain does. The scleractinian corals are not the only. They are the most important of these reef builders. And these particular organisms contain zooxanthellae. We talked about zooxanthellae in our last unit. And the corals and the zooxanthellae live together in what scientists call symbiosis. This is a relationship between these particular organisms where there's two organisms living and depending on each other for survival. And that's very important. There are some organisms that live with other organisms, but they don't necessarily need them in order to survive. These guys do. And this is a very particular type of symbiosis. Remember that zooxanthellae is a photosynthetic, a plant-like protista. Now, these corals can produce skeletons without the zooxanthellae. They can survive without them, but it's an extremely slow process for them. The zooxanthellae are producing sugars. And you can see them in this picture, all these dark little spots here. Those are the protists, the zooxanthellae, inside the tentacles of these corals. So the corals will stick their tentacles out of their skeleton. The zooxanthellae then will be now put out into the light, and they're able to do photosynthesis. The extra sugars that the zooxanthellae are making, the corals are going to use to produce ATP so that they can continue to grow and get larger. Most corals do not need to feed. That is, the cnidocytes in the tentacles do not need to be used if the zooxanthellae are receiving enough light. So where do we find most corals? We find most corals where there's a tremendous amount of light. So that feeding is important for you to know, that these corals do not need to actively try and catch their food, that instead they allow the zooxanthellae to do that for them. Now, there is another type of organism that helps to build the reef, and that is the coralline algae. Coralline algae. And these particular algae, this is a red algae, Rhodophyta, and it grows in these big sheets. Here's one that's on glass in an aquarium, probably about the size, a little bit bigger than a quarter maybe in size. Here's another one that's growing over here, encrusting these rocks. And this particular algae actually absorbs calcium carbonate into its cells, and that's what gives it this rock-hard feel to it. And what these particular organisms do is, as they grow and they're covering up rocks, any fine pieces of sand, sediment, things that are settling down from the water column above them, they will trap those particular things, kind of use those things as glue between rocks, as a kind of a bridge. And so what they're doing is they're cementing these rocks together. And these coralline algae, as they grow, they're strong enough in cementing these particular different rocks together to be able to withstand the crashing of any waves or any currents that might otherwise smash up corals. So these particular algae are growing over rocks. They also will grow over any hard item that might be in the water. Maybe it's a ship that sank, or perhaps even corals that have died and their skeletons remain. This will encrust those, grow over them, cement them down, and act as a very, very significant reef builder in the oceans. The conditions that are required for corals to grow and to form these reefs is pretty easy, specific enough for you to remember. They need a hard bottom. So they need some place for that polyp to attach to, and then it will start growing. They also need a lot of light. We talked about the zooxanthellae a moment ago. In order to get enough light, the water around the corals needs to be very, very clear. If the water around the corals is clear, the light can penetrate very easily. What this means is that the water actually needs to be very nutrient-poor water. Not a lot of nutrients, so we don't find huge, enormous coral reefs in those particular areas of the ocean where there's a lot of upwelling, like along the northern Pacific area near Alaska. Not a lot of corals growing up there. Not a lot of corals because there's too many nutrients in the water. They also need warm water. Another reason why we don't find those particular organisms where there's upwelling, because that's really cold water coming up to the surface. But they don't need hot water. If the water is too warm, they get stressed. And that stress is illustrated here in this particular picture. You can see part of this coral starting to turn white. And what's happening is the actual soft body parts of the organism are withdrawing into that skeleton. And what's left behind is that skeleton here. If this continues, and that water gets warmer and warmer and warmer, then this entire coral organism is going to start to die off. Now, each one of these polyps is contained in one little section of this organism. So there's a little polyp here, a little one over here, and over here, and over here, and over here. And you'll get to see some of those in class. This is actually a colony of these particular polyps. And what happens as they're starting to turn white, as they're withdrawing in, they need some more space, so they push out all the zooxanthellae, the organisms that are providing food for them. So eventually, this particular coral is going to die. Now you might think, well, why does it let that happen? Well, they're stuck on the substrate. They're stuck on the bottom. They aren't able to move. So these organisms can't get away from water that is too warm for them. And if it continues what we call this bleaching, then these corals are going to end up dying. So they need hard bottom, they need plentiful light, and they need warm water. Not hot, but warm water. Now, for this growth to decrease, yeah, we talked about that hot water, but there's a couple other things that typically happen. They don't do well with reduced salinity. That is, areas where there's a bunch of fresh water coming in, whether there's a lot of rainfall, or perhaps maybe there's a river that's washing all this fresh water into the ocean. That's not going to help these coral out at all. Also, along with that reduced salinity, if these organisms are near the mouth of a river, there's a lot of sediment. You've seen rivers. Look at the American River, the Sacramento River. They're brown, they're dirty. There's lots of stuff in the water. And that stuff is being washed out to the ocean. Well, that clouds the water. Therefore, if there's a lot of sediment in the water, it's not very clear. Not a lot of light coming in. The zooxanthellae aren't able to produce enough sugar. And then the last one, of course, pollution, since these organisms aren't able to move. Any pollution, it could be fertilizer. That is a pollution. Any amount of chemicals that are coming in higher than normal amounts can be considered pollution. Things like industrial waste and sewage. Those could be also considered this pollution for obvious reasons. But they increase the nutrients in the water. Fertilizers, too many, increase the nutrients. Might be good in some situations, but bad in others. And they're, again, going to increase the nutrients, cloud up the water. The sun's not going to be there. So what you find is that where there's low salinity, where there's lots of sediment, lots of pollution, in other words, where rivers are emptying into the ocean, we have a very distinctive lack of coral reefs in those particular areas of the ocean. Now we have three main types of reefs. Some of you, those of you that have been lucky enough to go down to areas like Cancun, might have been able to experience one of these particular types, and that's called the fringing reef. Now the fringing reef is the simplest, not very complex. There's not a lot of different layers to the reef. It's the most common, so simplest, most common. Usually it's found where there's some rocky or very, very hard substrate. And you'll find the fringing reef like this one right here growing in a very narrow band right near the shore. You can see the sandy beach right here. So we have this fringing reef that's growing right near the shoreline. It's very susceptible to runoff, to pollution, to sediment, to that fresh water. So those particular areas where we do have rivers, and right near the Cancun area, there's a few streams, creeks, and rivers that are flowing into the ocean. So this breakup of the fringing reefs there. But you'll notice that because this is so close to the shore, we have a lot of fresh water when it rains right here. So these particular reefs cannot get very large. But they do get very long. And the fringing reef actually makes up the longest reef in the world. It's about 4,000 kilometers long of a continuous fringing reef, and that's actually located in the Red Sea. The next particular type here is the barrier reef. And the barrier reef is actually out away from the shore. Here's a picture from really high. We're talking actually from space, this particular picture. Very similar to the fringing reef, but much further from shore, about 100 kilometers or so. And usually it's separated from, here's the shore, here's the water area here, here's the reef. This area here is a lagoon. There's a particular type of lagoon. We'll talk about some of those a little bit later on. But this particular area here is a lagoon, and this is protected by the reef from waves coming in. So the waves crash up here against the reef, and the water gently flows on this area. So here we have a very sandy area, partially sandy because the waves crashing into the coral break bits and pieces of the coral skeleton off and wash that over in this area. But this is a much calmer area with a sandy bottom. And then the third and final type of reef is an atoll. And these atolls, these are rings of reef. And you can see here's a particular picture of one right here. Most of these occur in the Western Pacific, kind of the Indo-West Pacific, so in that Indonesian area. And all of these are found very, very far from any remnants of land. And the reason is they have a very unique way of forming. And how these particular reefs form is around a volcano. So volcanic activity, there's an eruption happening, and over time, enough lava piles up and that we have a mountain forming that sticks out of the water. Well, as this mountain's forming, sticking out of the water, eventually the volcanic activity will stop. At that point, we have organisms that are able to colonate this area. Remember, these corals have a planula larva which swims around. So we have these larvae finding this rocky, hard substrate. The corals begin to form, and they form in a circle around this mountain. Well, over time, the mountain starts to degrade. Rainfall, waves, etc. It starts to actually collapse in on itself. Because remember, in the middle of this volcano is a big tube where the lava was coming out. So it collapses in on itself. And as it collapses in on itself, the reef is still living. It's still growing. And the volcano, as it's collapsing, the reef is growing up over and around it. So as it subsides, we have left this, what we have in this picture here, what we have down here, is the remnants of that coral reef still growing on top of the currently sinking volcanic mountain. So it will continue to grow and continue to grow and continue to grow. And the interesting thing is Darwin actually, in the early 1800s, when he went on his trip on the HMS Beagle, he actually saw some of these atolls, and he is the first scientist to actually put forth this hypothesis of this is how these atolls were formed. Well, in the 1950s, the U.S. Geological Survey actually went and drilled through the reef. And as they drilled through the reef, they got down several hundred feet, and they actually found volcanic rock under the calcium carbonate of the reef skeletons. And they proved that Darwin was, in fact, correct with his particular theory about how these atolls were formed. That's all of the information for our notes on the coral reefs. Pretty short, not a lot of stuff for us today. This will be our last set of notes for this particular semester. make sure you go back and have all this information dialed in pretty well. Next class period, we will be going through and doing the essential questions on this one. Thanks.